Our next speaker is Dr. Niigaan Sinclair. He is an activist, a writer, an associate professor, and the acting department head of the Faculty of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. He's a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press and a regular commentator on CBC, CTV, and APTN regarding current Indigenous issues. Niigaan, the floor is yours.
Okay, so bonjour de Niigaanweweidam Niigaanweweidam Sinclair Oya. Bonjour Mishomsak Nakumasak Mijana Kijik Namiji Nibakwe. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to share with you the language of the territory here in Treaty 1. Yeah, it's nice to be here. It's nice to be invited by Radhika and others to come and participate in this forum. I've written lots about the so-called Freedom Convoy and the ways in which it's overlapped and repeated many of the what we'll call Canadian hallmarks of identity. And so you can pick up my columns if you'd like for a much longer version of what I'm to say today, but I've written about this numerous times, and of course I'm on Power and Politics every Friday. So this has pretty much been a staple commentary issue for months now. And you know, what I'm concerned about, I'm going to bring about is three different things today. So the first is that this is evidence of individualism gone amok, and it's gone into a situation in which we're talking about individual rights as if we're conflating those with privileges and entitlements. This so-called Freedom Convoy was about privilege and entitlements, not really about rights. Because if the history of Canadian rights have anything to be defined by, it's most oftentimes defined by hallmarks of indigeneity. It is those things, healthcare, democracy, social welfare state, those are things that Indigenous peoples invented. Europeans had very little to do with those things. It was Europeans who, of course, added their ideas as they went. But you know, if democracy was invented in Greece or wherever else people want to argue that it came from, why did it disappear in Europe for hundreds of years? Why was it so irrelevant until suddenly finding its root here in North America? Well, it's because of Indigenous nations. And it's because we have concepts, really basic concepts like council systems or egalitarian leadership across the board. We have concepts of the social responsibility that takes precedence over the individual so-called right. And so the evidence of that is just within the basic tenets of Canadian identity. The things that we often deem as British politeness, or the things that we often deem as the kind of sense of collective responsibility as Canadians, or even multiculturalism. These are all Indigenous hallmarks of identity, which then shaped the state that we now know as Canada. And so those residues that come through and we see gaining a foothold in Canadian law are absolutely markers of indigeneity within the Canadian identity, the Canadian national state, the Canadian law and policy and practice. And so what we see is many of those things as being obscured or mutated, in which people think that those things are inventions of Europe when they are not. And these things that we now think of as these liberties, which then gets changed into, or challenged, perhaps best to describe it according to this pandemic. Those are the aspects that were the most helpful during the pandemic. It wasn't the arrival of the Charter of Rights and so-called liberties in the 1950s and 40s and so on. It was those markers, those residues of indigeneity that I talked about earlier that were left to fight in this ongoing march towards right-wingism across the country, which we see in most markedly in provincial premiers, but also within the federal government. Much of this pandemic has been about pitting public health against economy. And for about 2 years, economy has been slowly chipping away at the notions of public health. But the movement towards public health came from a sense of social and collective responsibility. That is precisely the residues of indigeneity that I was talking about. They came from the idea that the whole represents the value as much as the individual, in fact, more so. And so when you see, as an example, which is the second point I want to bring up, many people in your chat, by the way, want to talk about lockdowns, and they want to talk about the impact of lockdowns. And certainly lockdowns were not pleasant for anybody. And certainly all of us in Manitoba here, we're seeing the absolute end of that lockdown in about 48 hours from now, with the end of mask mandates in public settings, as well as there's no more any requirement for anyone to isolate if you've had COVID-19. So what you'll see is you just see people with positive tests. You know, they can go to work if they want. But anyways, I've had COVID-19. You can't go to work. You're a bit of a mess anyways. But the movement towards lockdowns were always kind of pitted against individual rights. And throughout the kind of right-wing premiers that go from Quebec all the way to Alberta, there was often this separation between the ideas of lockdowns as somehow compromising individual liberty. Now, let me tell you what happened on First Nations. We know for a fact that COVID-19 impacted First Nations more than anybody else, on the tune of people in long-term care facilities. That's how fast it would spread, because the issue of poverty, which has been instilled for 150 years by the Indian Act, which people have been hammered into poverty, put into dire health conditions and social conditions as a result of the ongoing colonization of territories, results in the quick passing, or just like during the Spanish flu way back in the day 100 years ago, the disease spreads very quickly in First Nations communities. And so First Nations, using that experience that happened 100 years ago, being very cognizant and aware of that history within our stories, and also the fact that within our very creation stories themselves, we have stories of epidemics, we have stories of how you deal with epidemics, and the answer, 100%, is to turn towards one another, not against one another. That is how communities continue. So that it means to have more social responsibility, not less. This is a key thing for you to understand, because this is what we taught Canadians when they arrived on in our territories, when we, for the first 200 years, Europeans were basically a footnote to this country, and that we were the ones teaching them everything as we went along. And so for 200 years, we tutored Europeans into this sense of social responsibility based within our creation stories and our cultures. And then therefore you get the basis and the foundation of what would later be known as Canada. Now, what did you see during the pandemic? You saw more First Nations taking what we would call more lockdowns, or more violations of individual rights, or what we as First Nations say, responsibility, in that people were instituting harsher lockdowns, curfews, way before Quebec issued curfews. They were issuing, following people's mandates, meaning that you go to a First Nation, you'd be followed in, you'd be supervised. You were to do something like drop something off at somebody's house, and then you'd be supervised to leave. What they did at the borders, the border checkpoints in First Nations, is they would check your odometer to say, oh, where were you going? You're going to Winnipeg, and then you're coming back. We're going to calculate that on our phone, and we're going to give you a leeway of, let's say, 20 kilometers. If you are above that, you're going to be fined. And that's what First Nations were willing to do. And so all of you who are talking about individual rights on this call and elsewhere, I'm going to bet that you probably wouldn't last more than a few minutes under that. You would have said something like, oh, well, my individual freedom trumps, and I use that word intentionally, the collective responsibility of my community. But notice that First Nations were willing, for the collective good of all, because we know that the disease would spread most rapidly, and we care about people like our elders. We put them at the primacy in the center of our community, and our children. We were willing to take it upon ourselves to take the social responsibility of our own individual freedoms for the good and the betterment of the community. First Nations did that absolutely collectively on their own. There was no provincial mandates for that. There was no federal mandates for that. That was First Nations doing that on our own volition. Now, throughout this entire freedom convoy, so-called freedom convoy, there has been a conflation of this with indigeneity. An absolute, much like, it reminds me a lot of the freedom convoyers flying the Canadian flag, when it is the very courts of Canada who don't give a legal basis for them to be there in the first place in Ottawa, or anywhere else for that matter. This convoy had zero basis in law, zero. There was not one court, there was not one judge, unlike the United States, where there was a couple, but there was not one court that threw out mandates, that threw out vaccine mandates or mask mandates, there was not one court in this country. Every single time somebody challenged a vaccine mandate or a mask mandate, I know this because we were on TV talking about it, every single time the court struck that down. So it is ironic and rather hilarious to fly a Canadian flag of the very state that is telling you that you are illegal. So like, you know, I was actually more adept to thinking about those who were flying flags that were either pre-Canada or some other, you know, the Confederate flag or even other flags that were being flown, because they were more likely indicative to what the Freedom Convoy was all about, not the Canadian flag. Because the Canadian flag was literally the courts, the institutions, not the political ones, but the so-called apolitical ones, the courts of the land, were the ones telling you that you were illegal. I mean, this isn't even a political issue. And so this conflation, however, with the Freedom Convoy, with the hallmarks of indigeneity, there's a number of things that were very concerning. The first is that the major leaders of this so-called convoy claim to be Indigenous. Many of them claim to be Métis, and subsequently, most of the Métis organizations that they claim to be affiliated with have either disavowed them or said that they're not part of those communities. So it's exactly the kind of theft of Indigenous identity that we see over and over and over again. Second, this was a colonizing force seeking to enter into public spaces, occupy them, and take up as much space as possible, and then enforce your views on everybody else, forcing those who are in those territories to be at the periphery. That is almost exactly the hallmark. If there's anything more Canadian about that, then I'd love to hear it. But there is nothing that Canada that's based in more Canadian individual processes of identity than that. And the third is that there is a small element, a very small but worth noting, element of racialization that were within this convoy. Some of them were Indigenous people. Some Indigenous peoples tried to combine this movement with a number of issues that involved certain, like murder missing Indigenous women and girls. There was a pronounced Orange Shirt Day by one of the Freedom Convoy leaders, which quickly, while there are individuals who may have given assent to the Freedom Convoy to use these markers of Indigenous activism and history, immediately, seconds following that, people like Phyllis Webstad, who is the founder of Orange Shirt Day, disavowed that action. All the First Nations who are in the territory of where there was a so-called First Nations camp set up in the Freedom Convoy village disavowed and asked them not to do ceremonies, quite politely, in fact. And then on top of that, every single time that they claimed to be affiliated with anything Indigenous, that group immediately disavowed them, to the tune of Cindy Blackstock most recently saying that they have no teachings. That's an actual quote, by the way. The people who are, the Indigenous peoples who are involved with that convoy. And that's one of our most revered and respected elders in all of our communities across this country. Now, I say that because this, my ultimate point is that this movement was ultimately about a product of Canada's history. It was a product in which not only were lands being stolen, identities being stolen, and then there was a great forgettance of how did we get here in the first place, but there was also a great repetition of Canada's colonizing and imperializing forces, which I think should force us all to ponder. Not to say that those are those people, but to say they are our people. And that is a ultimate and logical creation of the state in its continual treatment and mistreatment of Indigenous peoples across this country. And what we saw during the Freedom Convoy, we can talk about the far left and the far right, but for me, this is an ultimate issue of Canada having much of the issues that it itself has produced, and you know, for all of us, including those who are on this call, have been a part of the system, myself included, of producing this ongoing ignorance, mistreatment, and violence and genocide against Indigenous nations. And we saw it on ground zero in Ottawa. And we also continue to see it within the major institutions of this country. As many people have said before, if this was Indigenous peoples that were going to go colonize Ottawa, they wouldn't have made it 3 blocks. There would have been the army, there would have been no questions around bullets. You know, all this talk about the threshold of the Emergencies Act is a joke, because like if that had been Indigenous peoples, in fact, if that had been the Wet'suwet'en, like we saw with the Wet'suwet'en, there would have went in guns a-blazing in 20 minutes. It would have been absolutely no question whatsoever. And it wouldn't have been nice trucks they would have been taken away and very gently and charged with parking tickets. It would have been, you know, people put into jail for years and years and years, as you can see within, for instance, the individuals who are at the wetsuit, who are literally standing on their own lands and have a legal basis to do so, neither which the Freedom Convoy had. They weren't standing on their own lands, and they weren't standing with any legal basis to do so. Okay, so that's about all I want to contribute to for now, and I applaud and say thanks to you for inviting me to this conversation. I'm happy to stick around as long as I can, because I know that I'm not sure. I thought this was supposed to end at 1, but it's supposed to go till 2. Okay, all right. I'll try to stay as long as I can. I thought it was supposed to end at 1, but I have to take my daughter somewhere briefly, so I'll send a message if I have to go. All right, thank you. Niigaanweweidam.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.